Hi everyone, good evening. My name is Ruth McDonough. I'm a US and a UK citizen, and I apologize, this might be a little bit raw because last week at this time I was getting on a plane with Sultana, leaving Laayoune, and I'm still figuring out what all this means as a relatively newcomer to the Saharawi community and issue. And it's my honor to speak and to carry my experiences and message from the 75 days that I spent with Sultana and Ouattara and the rest of their family under siege. I was part of a volunteer team that responded to Sultana's call for international visitors and unarmed civilian protection. We were organized by a coalition of human rights groups in the United States in conjunction with Sultana and her network within Western Sahara. And I was one of two team members who stayed in the house with the Khaya family for 75 days of the siege before Sultana left Boujdour a week ago. During the time that we spent there, it was extremely clear that the Khaya situation represents a sampling of the tactics that are used to oppress the Sahrawi people, both materially, socially, economically, politically, and more. That was incredibly, incredibly clear. And I'm going to speak to the ongoing human rights abuses that I personally witnessed in Western Sahara, as well as the testimony that I collected about it. The day that my team arrived was the 482nd day that Sultana and Ouattara Khaya had been confined in their home. They had been isolated and repeatedly attacked, tortured, raped, poisoned, harassed, and monitored 24 hours a day for all 482 days of that by the perpetrators of those crimes. And I'm sure you can imagine what that was like within the house, or maybe you can't. And their mother, who, as Sultana said in her video, is 86 years old, was living in the home and their main contact with the outside world. And that meant when the utilities were cut off, when the water and electricity were down, that it was an 86-year-old who had her shoulders actually injured and ripped by the torture that she had endured in the home, having her hands tied behind her back. She was the one carrying her daughter's water while they couldn't leave the house. That's the kind of indignity that we came into. I can't, before I go on to what I personally witnessed, I can't overstate the importance of the international community in this situation. And my status as both a UK and a US citizen held incredible power, more power than I anticipated coming into that situation. It's a power that deterred the most brutal forms of violence from being carried out on the Khaya family while the team was there. And I'm in a room here in London. I feel compelled to call out the international community and all members of people living outside of Western Sahara, because the international community is at best willfully ignoring Morocco's violence against the Sahrawi people, and at worst aiding and incentivizing it. And because of the skewed power of the international community that we carried as civilian protectors, we also are aware that the behavior of the Moroccan forces around the Khaya family home changed because we were there, and that a lot of the violence that was happening was hidden from us as well as it could be, and even with that change in tactics, it was still incredibly obvious and still incredibly visible. So here are some of the things that I saw and unfolded while I was in the house. So up to 20 visible plainclothes Moroccan police officers surrounded the house where I was living for 75 days, 24 hours a day. We checked at all hours of the day and night. We could always see them. And their role was clear. At times they prevented people from entering the home, and there was consistent intimidation and always the possibility of violence at their hands. One example is a 14-year-old boy who was detained twice while we were there, and one of those times he was held in an adult facility overnight with no information to his family about what had happened or when he'd be released. Many visitors were turned away, and other visitors who made it to the house later were punished, including, as some of you may know, Zainabu Babi, who was one of the community members who joined us on the roof, calling for human rights and independence. And for this, she was detained, brought into custody, beaten for 3 hours, and then when she was released and was walking home barefoot with her clothes ripped, beaten twice more by men who pulled up next to her. And she had just gone out to buy bread for her children. She's had to have reconstructive surgery on her hands because the bones were so badly broken. And I didn't get to see Zainabu in person afterwards, though we've spoken on video, but I did get to see Fatima al-Hahabi, who was beaten with a nail-studded club on the same day that Zainabu was attacked. It was a systematic, 6 of the women who had been in the house were attacked on that day. And Fatima had punctured wounds all over her legs from the nails in the club that she was beaten with. So visitors across the community, women, children, and even repair workers who came to fix issues with the house, including Moroccan repair workers. One who was in his 70s was beaten for coming to offer services to the Khaya family while we were living there. There were also verbal threats that included visitors to the house being told that when we, the American and international visitors, left, that they would get the same as the Khayas had. I assisted in a makeshift medical clinic where we did our best to serve people in the community when they were able to get to the house, and I saw the lasting evidence of injury, beatings, and also the lack of access to medical services and facilities. And many of the people who showed us their scars also brought photos and videos to show us how they got those scars, or how over time those scars had developed and healed. So much. Well, what I can say is that, while we were in the house, there were no internal attacks on the house. No one got into the house. No one was raped inside the house. No one was beaten inside the house. But it seemed very clear, and it was stated very clearly to the activists who were attacked outside, that the violence was redistributed outside of it, from being concentrated on the Khayas to being concentrated across activists in Boujdour. And I also, of course, saw damage to the house, which included a poisoned well, cut wires, corrosive liquids poured on the walls, broken and destroyed furniture, and deliberately clogged sewage systems, which we continually were unclogging and then were getting reclogged outside the house because we couldn't protect them. These are some of the things that I experienced firsthand, and I also collected evidence. People entrusted me with their personal stories and their experiences and brought documentation to show that those stories were true, even though their words should have just been enough to be believed. I recorded hours of testimony, and I spoke with many Sahrawis informally, both in person and over the phone when they were unable to reach us due to checkpoints in the blockade around the house. Each person's story clarified patterns of human rights violations at the hands of Moroccan authorities. And I'm just going to name some of the themes that were brought up because there's no way that I can even scratch the surface. A total lack of freedom of speech, prisoners of opinion, arbitrary, cruel sentencing, forced disappearances, cruel and unusual treatment of children and members of the developmentally disabled community, torture and no legal recourse for survivors of torture, rape and sexual humiliation, especially in front of children and family members, beatings in custody, at checkpoints and in the street, random detainment, suspension of licenses to work and suspension of pensions, lack of access to education and health care, cultural erasure, consistent, visible, and spoken threats of violence, restriction of movement and travel within Western Sahara, home invasions, theft and destruction of property, environmental and economic disenfranchisement, disruption of indigenous values and ways of life, and targeted and brutal, disproportional violence of peaceful protest. And what was clear as these themes arose, I was able to write these down just after thinking about what did I hear. These aren't just one individual, and these aren't levied across everyone in the community, but any combination of these can be levied against any member of the Sahrawi community, and that's what I kept hearing, is that any combination of these can be used as threat and in reality to oppress and suppress Sahrawi voices.